Greetings, everybody. We are just, we're waiting for numbers to amass, but a number of you are already here. So I think we should go ahead and get started. So this is officially to welcome you all. I'm Polly Byers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Karuna Center. And I'm thrilled that so many of you could join us today. I think it speaks to the level of interest in this topic, which people come at from a lot of different angles and with different levels of understanding. So I think this will be a great opportunity to learn more about the issues around the unequal impacts of carbon emissions and how efforts to address environmental harm at the national level have often not included leadership from the communities most impacted. So this is really the genesis of this project you're going to hear about, called Transforming the Conversation on Carbon Pricing, or TCCP, as we refer to it as an acronym. And this was a project that Karuna co-led. It was housed with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a minute, but before we begin, just to let you know what Karuna Connectors is, which is basically an opportunity for interested people to learn more about the work, but to hear directly from our peacebuilding practitioners and partners. And it's also an opportunity to expand our network of supporters and partners. So we're thrilled that so many of you are here today. However, I can't begin without acknowledging the death of Paula Greene, Karuna's founder, just this past week, which was quite a shock, as she was fully engaged and going full tilt, as she always does and has. And it's an enormous loss to the peacebuilding community. But she did inspire a huge number of people around the world who will be continuing the work. And of course, Karuna is a part of that legacy. So I just wanted to begin with that. And then we'll be back in touch soon to let you know how we are planning to honor Paula, which will include the establishment of a fund for emergency response for our partners. But on another sad note, really the prompting for this program today was to honor Bob Mazur, who has long been one of Karuna's strongest, most dedicated supporters and donors over many, many years. And he also died very unexpectedly and suddenly earlier this year. And it's really completely due to his generosity and his deep commitment to focusing his energy and support on environmental issues that made this project possible. As many of you know, that most of Karuna's funding comes from grants that we apply for in response to proposals. But in this case, this is something Karuna wanted to do and went to Bob, who gave it his full support. So we want to extend our heartfelt sympathy to his family for the loss, and our deep gratitude for his support, which made this amazing project possible. So with that, I'm going to just briefly introduce our speakers and then hand it to Olivia. So Tina Johnson specializes in U.S. and international climate change policy, diplomacy, international change, strategic development, and advocacy. And she was instrumental in relaunching the National Black Environmental Justice Network as its director. And equity and justice are the foundation of her work and approach in creating systems change. And Olivia Stokes Dreier, who hardly needs an introduction, was the past director of the Karuna Center, and happily serves as the senior peacebuilding advisor for the organization and has extensive experience designing and undertaking multi-year peacebuilding programs around the world. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you. I would just note that they're going to talk for a little while, but please use the chat function for questions, and we will kind of be monitoring that and collect them, and we will try to answer. They will try to answer as many as they can at the end. So definitely type in questions as they arise. Over to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Polly. So I think I can't quite start without also acknowledging these two losses. I worked with Paula for the last 2 decades, since 2000, and she was my mentor, friend, close colleague. And so definitely reeling from that loss. Just 2 weeks ago, we were actively interviewing for a joint book project that we were very excited to be doing together. But I'm also feeling the responsibility to carry on her legacy. And actually, this is a project I often told her about, and she was very enthusiastic about, because she felt that, yes, in the early years, Karuna worked quite rightly on internationally, and that continues to be part of Karuna's mission, but how important it is that we start addressing the very polarized divides in our country as well. And Bob Mazur, who supported this effort, was just a wonderful friend to Karuna Center over the years. He was, his foundation supported us, but he always just took such a warm interest in what we were doing. And for a while, he was supporting work in the Middle East. And then I remember a few years back, him coming to me and saying, Olivia, at this point, work on climate is just going to have to be the focus of my foundation. And that's what I want to focus on. So we were evolving this project, so it was a really good fit. So I feel a great responsibility to carry forward what Bob was hoping to help make happen as well. My colleague Tina and I have been working on this project together from its inception, which has been great for me. It's been a great partnership. And Tina's going to start us off in terms of talking a little bit about the origins of this project, why we started it. I'll talk a little bit. We're going to show you a video, which we think will very much bring into focus what the experience of frontline communities that are very impacted by pollution in this country face. Just a 3-minute video. We'll talk about what we've done this far, what we plan to do in the future, and respond to your questions. So over to you, Tina.
Great, thanks, Olivia and Polly. I do want to say something about Bob, just because I did have a chance to interact with him via email and a couple of phone calls, and was really saddened to hear of his sudden passing. One, because selfishly, I enjoy receiving his emails, where we just bantered back about what we were doing, him talking about his grandchildren, or me talking about my experience here in Norway. So it's something that hit me hard. Even though we never met in person, it just felt like a good person was taken. And so that's always a hard thing. So, and I did not know Paula, but I do know the work of the Karuna Center and what Olivia has done and what Polly is doing, and know that it started in good hands. And I can only imagine the loss that the community has now and is going through. So my condolences to you and that family, and just a hug to everybody. You know, tough beginning of 2022. So I was introduced as Tina Johnson, and I am really one of 3 folks who helped start the transforming the conversation on carbon pricing. Along with Olivia, it was Tom Stokes from Pricing Carbon Initiative, and Danny Richter from the Citizens Climate Lobby. So this idea came about actually around a conversation regarding carbon pricing, but more importantly, the contention around the issue of carbon pricing, especially within the communities of traditional or larger green organizations and environmental justice organizations. And I've worked in international policy and domestic policy, and worked at the cross section of environmental justice along with that policy space, and just engaging in it, seeing firsthand that there definitely was this underlining historical context that created this animosity, for lack of a better word, within the community around many issues, but in particular the issue on a price on carbon. And so the goal of this space was, one, I'm going to share our objectives, was really to not work on policy per se, but really on how we would transform the conversation on carbon pricing. So our first objective was, and we wrote it in these aspirational terms, our hope is to transform the conversation on carbon pricing and create a more constructive process. Our second purpose was to learn how we can communicate and engage on the question of carbon pricing, not to advocate for any policy approaches. And this was super important for us because the idea within the framework of a price on carbon was that the policy exists, we know it's there, but how can we get the community to actually come together and start having a conversation around what was preventing them from having engaging, meaningful, forward-moving conversations, that even if they disagreed, that they actually could still be respectful of one another's opinions or perspectives or approaches to things, because they had a better understanding of what was happening from the other side. And so we created the space with this in mind, that we wanted to really dig deep into addressing the conflict so we could get to what I call an alignment of understanding. And maybe we get to a place where we could actually work on policy together, but that's not what we're doing. But like, just if we can get to that alignment of understanding, that could then help us to have a better way of engaging. So we started with I think we did this process of preparing the space for about 6 to 9 months, really doing a deep dive. Yeah, heavy lift, coming up with the objectives, writing a concept paper. We were the microcosm of the macro that we were trying to create. And so we were going through a lot of the struggles in creating a space in which we could actually transform the conversation between ourselves. And we were just a group of 3 or 4 people. So that was really interesting to see that. But again, the intention was, if we could do this work in the process of creating an intentional space, then we can move this into the macro so that we can actually engage a larger group of folks. And then also we took a lot of time to identify criteria. So, you had to have skin in the game. You had to be willing to be comfortable with being challenged, but also be respectful and responding. You had to really want to find a way to solve together the conflict, even if you weren't in agreement. So we really spent a lot of time designing the criteria around the space as well for outreach. And then we wanted 22, I think it was, about 20 folks to engage. And we wanted them to be at the same level. More often than not, when you have smaller frontline community organizations, their CEOs show up for everything because they don't have staff. And the larger green organizations have lots of staff. And so they can send their deputy or a junior staff person. So we really focused on making sure that we wanted the folks who could make the decisions in the room for their organization at the same level, to create not an equal level playing field, but to make sure that the conversation came at the same level for each organization. So we had CEOs from Big Greens and EJ community organizations, faith organizations, and labor, who participated and committed to being a part of this for 2 years. And so that's sort of how we sort of germinated the space. And then the work from there really was to root us in the work of finding out whether or not we could meet the objectives that I just shared with you. And our first meeting was in October of 2018. No, was it 2019? It was 2019, our first meeting. It's been a long time. 2019, outside of DC, where we convened for our in-person meeting to set the stage and the groundwork for that space. And it was a huge success. We spent 2 days together, digging in deep, really focusing on the trauma of this work and the trauma of the space for many folks who have been engaging from different perspectives on this issue, and really trying to understand where that trauma is coming from. And so we had a really special session where we had 2 EJ leaders sit in a circle and share their experience while the other folks sat around the circle and heard from them, and then opened up the space to actually ask questions or to share what they heard back. But what was meaningful about this was that we got to humanize the trauma and understand what it was connected to, that for some folks, it had been 30 years in the making, where they had been burned and disenfranchised from the policy space and decision-making when it came down to how their communities would actually show up and be engaged in how they could solve problems without them being forced on them and then being rejected by the bigger community if they didn't fall in line. So it's really meaningful and very touching. And it also was really humbling, which was one of the other underlining objectives we had internally in our steering committee, was to have a humility about the space. And then we moved on from there with consensus from the group after hearing from, and I think Olivia will talk about who was in the room with us as well. We brought economists in, we brought EJ economists in and organizers in to talk through the space with us in the very beginning. And then we moved on after, COVID, we've all been hit by it. It was devastating, but we had to adjust our process to be more online, where we had first decided we would be in person for at least 2 in-person meetings and do a few online meetings, but we ended up doing more online meetings. And during the pandemic, that became more frequent. So it actually ended up being more of we spent more time together than we would have had if we had done the original timeline. And in that, we were able to engage with the Hill, staff from the Hill, who were putting forth carbon pricing policies to really think through and talk about what the environmental justice impacts would be. And this was really this was timely because Biden's whole platform before he became president was really to focus on environmental justice and make it a mainstay of his agenda if he were to be elected. And then when he was elected, it breathed this enormous amount of fresh air into this possibility that there could be a price on carbon. There isn't. But then this space became really important again, because now we had built these relationships where we could have these conversations around policy. And what we were seeing was that people were now, folks who were in the room with the policymakers helping create or design the policy, were also saying, have you talked to environmental justice communities? Have you engaged them? This is who you should be talking to. We can't support this unless you've talked to the EJ folks. And so that was within a year, just seeing that transformation within the space made the work that we were doing with TCCP very, very, very successful. I think the most successful part of the work, from my perspective, really has been the relationship building that we've been able to do, because ultimately we use carbon pricing as a vehicle. It's an issue area. There are many within the climate and environmental space, but we decided to focus on one issue because we can't solve them all. One that was filled with conflict, contention, distrust, and had the potential to engage a broader community around how can we solve a problem together if we could get into a good space or a pattern where we could just think it together. And that is something that doesn't happen all the time. Instead of having people who are fighting the same good fight, fighting against each other, we created a space where folks could fight the same good fight and find ways to respect each other, even if they were fighting from different perspectives and with different opinions, but could find a way to find some mutuality, some commonality around what would be the best way forward, with equity and justice as the lens. And I would say this and turn it over to Olivia, but I think that was one of the other really amazing things that came out of this, was that equity and justice as the framework by which we create policy really became the mantra, that we really need to have this be the way in which we approach this work if we're going to see communities solve their problems or have their problems solved with policy that could either exasperate it or actually alleviate it. And so that was really promising to see that and to continue to see that in the work. So those are my 5 minutes.
Great, Tina. Thank you. So I'm just going to add in on a few places, maybe just going back a bit. Karuna first got involved around this back when the cap and trade bill failed in Congress, the Westman-Markey bill. And my brother, who I think is on the call and runs something called the Pricing Carbon Institute, wanted to organize a retreat because this is back over a decade ago, there was a lot of tension around its failure. And it was being cap and trade. It was not a bill that environmental justice folks mostly supported. It was going to create derivatives. It was looking only at global impacts. It was certainly not looking at localized cumulative impacts on frontline communities. But tensions were arising from all sorts of sources in terms of, for environmental justice people, I think both they had been not included really in the process, their support had not been really asked for, they hadn't been engaged with, and the content itself was problematic. And for those of you who haven't followed these things closely, I think it's important to recognize that the process around these things has been really, really important and not as inclusive and therefore successful as it could be. But also the content has been an issue that frontline communities, for very good reason, have not put much faith in sort of what maybe get termed as market-based solutions to curbing carbon emissions. That, you know, market-based solutions haven't really helped their communities in the past. Why should they think they would in the future, when, you know, what's going to actually prevent their families from suffering from asthma and all the other things that that come along with pollution, especially when refineries are put in their backyards. So that was why we really focused on this. I remember in an early on discussion, one of our members from a big environmental group very passionately saying, but, you know, the urgency, the crisis we're facing as a planet, we can't, everything you're saying, you know, from more of an environmental justice and localized impacts perspective is important, but this is so urgent. And this African-American economist who's been very involved with environmental justice groups and doing really good, solid research on impacts said, well, who are you saving the planet for? And that to me was like a really powerful statement, and sort of highlighted why you can't just proceed without an equity and justice lens. But so Karuna Center first got back involved 10 years ago. We were then helping with the Pricing Carbon Institute with these dialogues they were holding in DC, kind of playing a supportive role. We had been brought in initially as facilitators. And those, that was trying to create this very large tent around pricing carbon policies and bringing both progressives and conservatives and business and labor and faith groups to the table to try to find some alignment. And the invitation was very open to environmental justice, but I don't think it was a comfortable space for them to show up. It was very DC centric. It was a very white room. And that was part of the sense of we need to create a much more intimate kind of space where we could develop the kind of trust building that Tina has been talking about. And I think, as you said, Tina, it really was that first retreat where we had those concentric circle dialogues and people speaking in pairs and really trying to understand more deeply the impacts on frontline communities, that something began to shift that we were then able to build on. And I have to say, for me, it took a while. You know, what it's like to live in one of those frontline communities is certainly not my lived experience. And it took for me a while to sort of, for it to totally sink in just how unjust. And we'll talk a little bit more about where we've come in the last year, but just this fall, we did a retreat in New Orleans. We'll tell you more about that. But for me, the most impactful part of it was getting to see what's called Cancer Alley, which is a 100-mile strip along the Mississippi River, where it stretches from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and it's refinery after refinery right along the banks of the Mississippi in what used to be wonderful traditional, communities, a lot of African-American communities along their rich cultural life. So we wanted to show you just this 3-minute video that focuses especially on Cancer Alley, but I think it's helpful to see.
Right now, I couldn't sell my house for $50. Who wants to move to Cancer Alley?
Louisiana is the 3rd largest energy producer and we're the 2nd poorest state. We're last in education. We're last in health. So the payoff didn't happen. Cancer Alley, anybody come in with a pot of money and said, hey, we want to put a plant here and we're going to bring 500 jobs. They lay the red carpet out for them. And they give them a big ass tax break. Those 150 chemical plants are having a big impact on people's health and having a hell of an impact on our climate. But the entire government, from local, state, and federal government, don't enforce the rules. And they allow the lobbyists to push them in to give exceptions and exemptions. And this is how we've gotten into the problem we got with this much concentration of pollution in one place. But remember what a permit is. You know what a permit is? A permit is an authorization to pollute. Don't ever forget that.
When I was a little girl, oh, that fresh breath of clean air. It was so wonderful. Now you go out the door, you're gonna smell chemicals. I didn't think the plants were polluting us because the plants always say they're good neighbors. They give little boxes of something and little stuff for the school, buy our Christmas dinner, stuff like that. We thought that was nice. We didn't know the plant was killing us, buying us a little something to shut us up, I guess. I think it's racism because years ago, they wanted to put a plant in a white area in St. James and they voted it down because it was going in their area. When they put it in the 5th district, oh yeah, let's throw it over there. And they all vote for it. Isn't that sad? That's really sad.
We want it now. Bring the production down until you find a safe way to operate. We have the right to have clean air, clean water, and clean soil. If they can't let us live clean, they need to shut it down. I guarantee you're not going to ever do. Somebody's going to show you these little devil eyes that you keep in your purse. Everybody has to use it, even the children. That's how bad the air is. I feel if EPA would do their job, regulate these plants, stay on top of them, we would be much better off. But they're giving them all kinds of excuses not to get there. But at the same time, we're still dying. We're still sick.
I think when you see that, certainly for me, seeing it physically, it just so brings home that, yes, absolutely, to save our planet, we need to bring carbon emissions down. But as we're developing policy, we also have to think about those communities that are most affected, and that the two should be going hand in hand. And I think that's why it was really important in our group to develop together an equity and justice lens, think through what an equity and justice lens would look like. And then after that, as Tina mentioned, we had 3 people from the Hill talk to us about different bills that had been presented. Really only one of the 3 took into account any sorts of environmental justice considerations. And it was really nice to hear from our group, not only the environmental justice groups represented, but also the large environmental groups saying, wait a minute, this can't work. So that's been effective, powerful, I think. The other thing that I just wanted to mention that was really affected our group, I think, is when we moved on to Zoom. So that was the start of the pandemic. It was also right around the murder of George Floyd, and people in our group were being affected differently by COVID. So, you know, several people who were representing frontline community organizations knew more people who were getting COVID, were getting really ill with COVID because of pre-existing conditions. So having that come right into our discussions, I think was also really, really important. So fast forward, because we want to have plenty of time for questions. We had a final.
Olivia,
Oh, yeah,
wait,
please.
wait, before you fast forward, I just wanted to, because I wanted to touch on COVID and PM 2.5 and why that increase of folks dying at a higher rate in places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana happened. And it was a direct correlation to the pollution that they've been exposed to, that the PM 2.5, which is in their system already, the COVID could just hitch a ride on the vascular and the vascular diseases they were already having, their asthma, their poor health, and wreak havoc on their system. So before we had a vaccine, before we actually knew what we were dealing with, they were already being inundated with COVID because their bodies were just ripe for the virus to live in and take refuge in their system due to the pollution they were already experiencing. And so the question for the communities now, or when we have another pandemic, because we will, what will that look like if we don't get this under control? So it really hit home because you had George Floyd and we can't breathe, and then we can't breathe because we're being polluted and we're dying because of COVID. So it was a really powerful confluence of social justice issues with environmental justice issues brought together, because those things are very closely related to one another, and the way in which we see frontline communities impacted. So just wanted to add that part.
Oh, no, thank you, Tina, for that's so super important. So thank you. We had what we considered the final retreat of this first phase of TCCP this past November in New Orleans. So we finally made it there. The Deep South Environmental Justice Center hosted us. They've been working there for many years. It was an opportunity for us to kind of evaluate where we had come over the last 2 years. We had the tour of Cancer Alley, and then to think about next steps. Did we want to move forward with TCCP? That wasn't a foregone conclusion, but if so, what did we want to do? And I think the general consensus was those initial objectives that Tina read out had been met. We felt we had created a trusting space where very authentic conversations could happen, where all kinds of issues could be brought up. And there was a general feeling, though, if we were to continue, we wanted to roll up our sleeves and get more concrete, engage more concretely with policy. And I think I'll turn it back over to you, Tina, to talk about what we're thinking about next.
Yes, and so one of the things that rose to the top for the group, and Olivia and I were both in agreement on this, was that if we were going to continue this work, we had done the trust building process. We've gotten to a place where this group of people have a culture in which they can work with one another, communicate with one another, call each other up when there's some news that they want from one another in a meaningful way that was authentic, that was not transactional, and that sorry, I'm learning Norwegian, so sometimes my Norwegian and English really gets messed up. So I'm like, that's not a word. Anyway, but that wasn't transactional, but was mutually beneficial to move the work that they cared about forward. And so we really wanted to see where we could go now that we were in this space as a group to contribute to the overarching discussion on carbon pricing in the policy realm. Can we design policy that is rooted, grounded in environment, in equity and justice, and taking that broader environmental justice lens, but narrowing it into this sort of really streamlined, clear understanding that everybody wants, we all believe in equity, we all believe in justice. Can we make that the framework that we work towards in designing policy that actually has the full breadth and depth of what communities on the front line would potentially be interested in seeing put forward as a bill that could be passed. And that really is a different approach where previously groups have been consulted, but not engaged in the actual process of designing policy at the federal level. There's a success story with Nikki Sheets in New Jersey where they've been able to pass some cumulative impact policy there that has been really impactful for environmental justice communities, but that equity and justice frame in the federal policy and what that could look like. And so the group has said that they're interested in moving in that direction and sort of rethinking, I would say unthinking the way in which we've been doing design around carbon pricing in particular, and creating a new way and a new approach to the way in which we should think about how it would be designed. And the goal with this would be not to circumvent what's already out there, but would be to add to the conversation to make the existing policy be more reflective of the overarching need to have transformative approaches to how we create policy that's inclusive of the things that make it possible for transformation to actually exist. And I'm of the hardcore belief that if you do not have equity and justice as a framework by which you design anything, you will continue to create a system that fails the majority of people, even if the minority of people feel like they're successful. So that's where we are, and so we're in the process of thinking through this. We had our first meeting just a few weeks ago to talk about what would this look like. So we're at the stage now of regrouping and thinking through our new objectives and the new criteria for this space and who should be invited and how do we do that outreach and what would this look like to get to that place. And so the group that we started with will change and has changed. And we will open it up, not too big, because it's too many people, too many chefs in the kitchen mean that you really don't get a good meal. So we really want to narrow that down, but broaden that scope at the request actually of the environmental justice folks in the room at our retreat in New Orleans, to really focus that on equity and justice so that groups can come to the table representing their issue area or their communities without that sense of feeling that they're speaking on behalf of all of the big greens or all of labor or all of faith or all environmental justice communities, but they're really focused on equity and justice as it pertains to their interest in policy design and the potential impact it could have on the work that they're doing. Did I leave anything out, Olivia?
I don't think so. I think probably we can turn it to questions and other things. If we've forgotten things, they'll come out through the questions.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you both. I think that was super helpful and super interesting just to kind of really get a real understanding of the whole process. So people, you're welcome to unmute yourselves and just ask. I think we can do that, or type in to the chat. But maybe just to start, it would be interesting, that sort of, it's that groundwork stage. It seemed like that was just sort of a little more I don't like the word granularity, but just a little more detail of what that looked like. I mean, you had, as I've been talking to Tina for, people who really were not talking to each other. There was not trust there. So of how you kind of created that space a little bit to get to where you then could be, this to where you ended up getting, but maybe just talking a little bit more about how that worked, how that happened, that you were able to engage people and who were not really, maybe whatever, the relations were not good. Let's just say that we're able to bring them together, that initial phase of, the preparation, just talking a little bit more about the challenges and what that looked like, and then go from there.
You want to start, Tina?
Sure. I would say that the work that we did at the steering committee level was really it was key to the work that we were able to do within the larger group. As I said earlier, the steering committee was a microcosm of the macro that we were trying to create. And so one of the things that we had to be okay with was that we needed to be comfortable with being uncomfortable within our own space of creating this space. And we wanted that to also be part of the way in which the space existed with the larger group. And so when we created the criteria for who we would reach out to based on the criteria, it really was a lot of discussion. We're okay with the conflict and the tension. We want that. That's really important. It creates a dynamicism that's required. It's real. But what we don't want is there to be animosity to the point where folks can't be comfortable with being uncomfortable because they're defending themselves. And so we really wanted to create a balance, an imbalance that could teeter together, that the community that we were building could write themselves as they got to know one another. And so we weren't looking to create a space that said, okay, we're all going to be friends. We didn't know, but we wanted to create a space where people, one, were interested in the issue, were interested in the other people who were going to be discussing the issue, and were interested in finding a way to actually talk to one another, learn from one another. And I think we really were extremely successful and extremely effective because of the intentionality that we put in to designing the space from the very beginning. And even within the steering committee, we had conflict. We teetered. We had that balance and imbalance there. We had to work through our own issues within our steering committee as we're trying to create this space. And so we were like, oh, if this is what we're going through, this is what and we saw it. We saw exactly that same thing. But our intention was, how do we work through the differences to get to a place where we can have an alignment around understanding. And so again, I'm a huge believer in creating intentional spaces. And so the objectives that we came up with, which we spent weeks doing, I mean, it was weeks, it wasn't days, getting two objectives that we felt good, that we could hold, that could hold us throughout a 2-year process. That also really helped us to create the space to be able to do this deeper dive. And that's what we went back to that every time. Whenever we steered away from what our mission was, we go back to our objectives. This is what we're trying to get done. And okay, yep, this is what we're doing. And we use that in our steering committee, but we also use that in the larger space that, hey, we're not trying to resolve policy here, even though you want to talk policy, we're not doing that. And folks were like, okay, yeah, we're not doing that. So it really was that intentionality and being really clear about the focus and the overarching goals that we had that really helped us to create this space and to make it. And again, I'm saying this, and maybe it's not very humble, but that was really beneficial for everyone that participated, to the point where they're like, this is a space, we've heard this from many of the participants, this is the first time that I've been in a space where I have felt heard about these issues that really have been a problem for me over the last 30 years of me doing this work. or that this is the first time I feel that I'm actually in a room full of people who support my perspective, even if we're not in agreement. They get it. So there was a lot of this really clear that we were successful in getting to that point. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I would just add quickly, and maybe this is a parallel with Karuna's peacebuilding projects, that when we're doing peacebuilding in a war-torn country, we don't usually invite in the people who are at the most opposite poles. You know, we invite in the people who want to engage and hope that that will then ripple out. So I think in our criteria for who to invite, we were thinking of people who would want to engage around this issue, and from both an environmental justice perspective and from a Big Green perspective. I see the question of who the group facilitators were. It was Tina and myself. We, you know, I think us developing a really good co-facilitation relationship was really key and important. We did have ground rules, particularly that first real meeting was the in-person retreat. I think that it was in person. We developed group agreements and ground rules together. And then I think also perhaps parallel with other peace building projects is that humanizing element. You know, people went off in pairs, somebody from more of an environmental justice perspective, some from a Big Green perspective, kind of sharing something around their lived experience around the tension that exists between Big Green and environmental justice. And then we had those kind of concentric circles that Tina suggested, and it all sort of layered on each other. And I think it was a real listening space where people were not defensive. They were not immediately, you know, feeling attacked or ready to shoot back. That it was trying to understand what are the roots of this? Where does it come from? How can it be addressed?
That's great. You know, sort of related to that, and there's a couple of Christopher St. John has a great question related to what's happening in the Ukraine right now. But Dan asked earlier about, you know, how trust and humility comes into the room. I mean, you've been describing that somewhat, but are there, I mean, you know, people are asking about the facilitation because obviously there's a lot of skill. I mean, that's a lot of the work, I would say, in this facilitation that you and Tina managed. But he was asking, are there books about that? I don't know if you have anything to say there or not. The other, you know, I mean, I don't know if either of you want to speak to this, but Christopher St. John said, you know, it seems inevitable how this work might meet the moment we're in right now, with Putin having brought an instant carbon price increase that will have such very unequal consequences around the world. I mean, point well taken. Anyways, he also followed up that, you know, this is such an important issue that it seems to beg for bigger financial support from bigger funders. But I don't know, you know, I don't know if you have anything knowledge about that. Are there any other efforts like this that either of you are aware of that have had the kind of success actually that you have had, or similar, just or not?
I think the short answer to that would be no, but it's not because there aren't folks doing work. It's just that our approach really was about building the trust before we get to the work. So that was really important. It was so important not to say, let's create policy. And then when it doesn't work, we go on about our way and say, thanks, but no thanks. It really was, let's create relationships to see if we have enough in common that we are willing to sit down together and think through this together. And so that's not something that happens often. And the reason why it doesn't, and this is something that my work that I do is really focused on this. It's really important that the short-term gain that we get and that we strive for, especially in the political space, which is around an election cycle normally, cannot usurp the need for long-term planning and relationship building. And that this work really was about the seeding of relationships that could grow and develop so that it could work towards long-term solutions that could be transformational, not this transactional relationship where we only get what we get in this short period of time. And if it doesn't work out, we can just go about our business. And so there is that intentionality around, can we think beyond ourselves as far as what we think the time frame is for success? And you can do that if you focus on, can we create relationships of trust? And then that, can we begin to think about the future together? But you can't do that. You can't think about the future together if you can't talk to each other. So that would be one thing. And then I just want to respond to the carbon pricing question around that's going on with Ukraine and Russia. This is a concern because right now, just about every major oil company is saying they're going to pull out their stakes from Russia. And then the question is, where will they go to next to extract? Will they go to the global south and set up shop there? Will they exploit more communities? So there is this global conversation, not just about carbon pricing in the context of having reduced access to oil and gas from Russia, but when countries need to provide for their own sovereign energy access, and you see what happens when something like this occurs, it begs the question of the urgency, who gets left behind to answer the urgent need that we see coming because of a useless war, or because the planet is burning. And so there's this struggle right now. And then there's a new IPCC report that came out yesterday that says that, you know, the impact of climate change is some parts of it are irreversible. So we have this language here with all of these things, which then brings up the question of technology, which is another thing, right? So all of this sort of snowballs into, we have to act, we have to act, we have to do, without any real understanding of the process of doing it so that it's equitable and it's just, and it doesn't do harm. And so I think that's part of the work. That isn't part, it is the work that we are doing with TCCP, is saying, let's take a second. We can take a second and think through this in a more effective way.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I remember at that very first retreat, not to generalize, but some of the folks who were there sort of from the big green side were like, all right, so what does environmental justice want? You know, what are the things that aren't there that would need to be? And for the environmental justice people, it was more, again, not to generalize, but it was more, no, actually, we have to move more slowly. We don't trust you yet. You know, we work in a way, our work is about relationship building. That's how we work in our communities. And that's the way we work. And I think it took a while for the whole group to sort of get that and slow down enough to recognize what a critical piece that really is, and that you're not wasting time. You actually then move forward way more effectively when those relationships are built. You move forward more quickly, you really do. And then I'm noticing the question from Patty Moore.
Patty, yeah.
About, okay, so you've built relationships, seems like a base for future action. What do you see as next steps? And that's what we were alluding to, I think, earlier. We're just kind of on the start of that, but it really is to think about much more concretely what are design elements that would need to go into pricing carbon policies that would really have an equity justice lens. So not to write policy, but to get much more concrete around that. And we do see expanding the group, that there's certain people that we want to bring in that we feel have that kind of experience in making policy that could help with that aspect, as well as to get more people in from smaller environmental justice groups who would be coming at it from different perspectives and angles. So we're really just developing that phase, but we feel like we're ready to move forward in more actionable ways.
That's great. Well, I am looking, I know that, I'm sorry, there are some more questions here we didn't get to answer, but I do want to honor the time limit of an hour, which we said. So I really want to thank you both, Olivia and Tina, for the work, because it is really impressive, honestly. And I think it's super insightful and groundbreaking. So I think obviously people are, are going to be interested to hear more. And to the point in the chat right now, funding is an issue. And to that point, we certainly, it does take a lot of support. So we're certainly grateful to Bob Mazur, as we said at the beginning, without whom this would not have happened. So I can't say enough how deeply we appreciate that, and certainly welcome your support to continue this work. We do hope to continue with Tina is involved in a lot of projects herself, and obviously the group has ideas about how to continue. So we would we'll keep you updated and love to have your support, and cannot thank you enough all for attending. We are going to send, if you want to spend 2 minutes, I promise not more, a little survey after this just to get your input on this. It would be great, and any feedback. And we will keep you posted. There will be another Karuna Connector coming up in the next 2 months, which we don't have a date for yet, but it'll be on our website and sent to all of you who are on the email list. So a huge thanks to Tina and to Olivia for the time today and your work, and can't thank you enough. And thank you all for coming. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.